Welcome. Hi, I'm Mikki, and this is Mikkipedia, where I sit down and chat to doctors, professors, athletes, practitioners, and experts in their fields related to health, nutrition, fitness, and well-being. And I'm delighted that you're here. Hey everyone, it's Mikki here, and you are listening to Mikkipedia. This week on the podcast, I speak to Dr Sara Campbell all about exercise, the gut, and our gut microbiome. So Sara is an expert in this area, and we discuss the bidirectional relationship between the gut and our exercise patterns, what sex differences might exist, and the relative usefulness of probiotics and prebiotics for helping optimize our gut health. It's such an exciting time for research in this area with so much that we don't know. However, Dr. Campbell is pioneering the research with regards to what we do know. So hopefully you enjoy our conversation. Now, Dr. Sara Campbell is an associate professor and the graduate program director in kinesiology and applied physiology at Rutgers University. She's got a specialist research area in metabolism, the gut, and the impact of exercise on the gut. And I've got a link as to where you can find Sara and her most recent publications in the show notes. Now, before we kick off into the conversation, just like to remind you that the best way to support this podcast is to hit like and subscribe to your favorite podcast platform. That would be amazing, because that just means that more people are made aware of the fact that Mikkipedia exists. Further, if you want to go that one step ahead, you can click subscribe to Recipe Portal Access on my website, MikkiWilliden.com. $12 a month, you get a regularly updated recipe library, access to our Real Food Nutrition community page, weekly Q&A, written forums, my weekly email, and the opportunity to ask me questions, nutrition and health related, through our online messaging platform. So that's another way that you can just support the podcast. All right, team, enjoy the conversation that I have with Dr. Sara Campbell. Dr. Sara Campbell, thank you so much for taking the time to sit down and talk to me today about exercise, about the gut, about probiotics, antibiotics, sex-based differences, and all of that super fun stuff. Can we kick off by you telling us how you even got into researching this area? Because nowadays, we're also familiar with the idea that the gut is like the nexus of health, but probably when you were doing it, it might not have necessarily had that reputation.
True. Actually, what got me interested was a PubMed search that turned 0 results. So I was like, wow, this seems like an open area of research. So previous to the gut, I was actually interested in atherosclerosis and cholesterol metabolism. And I came out of my postdoc and had a conversation with a colleague. And he's like, what can you contribute to this area? You're a new assistant professor. You kind of have to explode on the scene. What are you going to do that's different? And I had one of those existential crises. And I'm like, oh my God, can I even do anything different? And so I have this dual background of a PhD in exercise physiology, but this postdoctoral fellowship that focused on functional foods and nutrition. So I'm like, okay, how do I combine that into something interesting and unique and leave, with obesity, because that's kind of an area that became interested, obviously, with heart disease. There's all these connections. So I was like, what if there's this thing going on where you might need, say, more antioxidants if you're, say, overweight or obese? There's this maybe chronic low-grade inflammation that's going on. Do you need, something different? So that got me looking into, digestion, absorption. And then I kind of got into like gut, obesity. And that's when some of those really early papers from like Peter Turnbaugh and Jeff Gordon's group and Ruth Lay and all of those, I was like, this is really interesting, linking, metabolism to the gut microbiota. And we all know exercise is a really fantastic way to improve metabolic health and make all of these crazy, adaptations. So like, I wonder, and I really did just put in exercise and gut microbiome. and there was zero. And I was like,
Wow.
wow. I know exactly. I was like, wow, okay, well, here I go. And I kind of just started, using that expertise of just study design and looking at how others had looked at the microbiome and kind of incorporated that into our exercise and nutritional interventions. And I guess you could say the rest is history, but that's really how I got started.
Yeah, amazing. And it's quite, your research has informed a lot of what we know about exercise and how it impacts on the gut. But also, is it a bidirectional relationship? So I'd really love to sort of, is there a one-on-one, I suppose, on how exercise might impact on the gut, but also how your gut might impact on exercise, and maybe they're two quite separate topics.
No,
but yeah.
what's really amazing is I just about a month ago, not even 20 days ago, got invited to the microbiology symposium at Rutgers. It's all, for Rutgers, but it's the Rutgers folks who are involved in microbiome. And the title of my talk is The Bidirectional Link Between Exercise and the Gut Microbiota. And
Yeah.
I absolutely think that there's this two-way street. We started off and as we did as well early in my research is, okay, if you exercise, does that promote beneficial changes to the gut microbes? And we found in most studies will tell you, yeah, there's this, increase in butyrate producing bacteria. There's some that have shown increases in butyrate itself as the short chain fatty acid in your gut. Others have shown there's an enzyme called B-coat, which is responsible for the production of butyrate in the intestine. And so, okay, great. So exercise definitely manifests these changes. And I think we've gotten to the point now, it's like, okay, we can pretty firmly say exercise can manifest a healthy gut microbiota, right? But then how do we look at the reverse? What do we do? Does an intact gut microbiota become essential for exercise? And, some of the first papers that started coming out were in the mid 2010s. Is that even a term? Like 2015 was one of the first papers that I saw where they used a model with germ-free animals, which is basically an animal that has no microbes. And they basically put it in a little beaker with water and said, hey, let's see how long you can swim. And it swam significantly less than those animals that we call SPF, specific pathogen free, which have their total microbiome, but no pathogens. So you can honestly say, it wasn't a pathogenic microbe or something detrimental. It's just got all its microbes, but the good ones versus an animal that has no microbes. All right. And so this has been actually looked at a couple of times, whether it be using that germ-free model or what we tend to use is antibiotic treatment. So you get this cocktail of antibiotics and you give it to the animal in its drinking water over the course of a couple of days and you knock out that microbiota. And then you kind of retest them after several weeks of exercise training. And the findings are quite similar with that microbiome completely, or not completely, but 90-ish% gone. They have a significantly reduced exercise capacity. Time to exhaustion, running distance, and so forth. So that I think says a lot. There have been other studies that are coming out, including some of our own data that have looked at antibiotic treatment in hypertrophy. So a colleague of mine, John McCarthy, out in Kentucky, did this really elegant study with his PhD student, Taylor, and they gave antibiotics to their mice, and they have this power protocol where it's meant to produce hypertrophy and all of the amazing things that go with that, and found that those mice that were given antibiotic did not experience the hypertrophy that animals with an intact microbiome. So there definitely seems to be something with, the skeletal muscle. I mean, we looked at skeletal muscle function in terms of mitochondrial oxidation and mitochondrial biogenesis and found that with antibiotics, those markers were reduced in the muscle. So there's definitely some of this bidirectional communication, right? Exercise can influence those gut microbes, but those microbes definitely will then feed back to, the skeletal muscle in particular, likely other areas that's lots, looking at the heart and so forth. So various areas that are critical to, exercise adaptation and exercise tolerance seem to be disrupted either in that germ-free model or when given antibiotics. So it definitely is bidirectional. At least I feel that evidence emerging starts to really suggest that.
Yeah, totally. And it makes sense, right? If you think about all the other lifestyle factors that contribute to the health of the gut, and you can see changes in that gut microbiome when you change your diet, for, as I understand it, that like it takes, just a few days or maybe not even that much if you change your diet to see a change in some of those species in the gut. Is that right?
Right. So I think one of the things that's more interesting is it actually that those maybe are changing, but, kind of an abrupt dietary change will alter then who becomes active or more abundant, right?
Yeah.
Because you've adjusted that. There's some evidence that, my colleague at Rutgers, Li-Ping Zhao, did this really great study that he put out a couple of years ago and was looking at just a prebiotic. He has a traditional Chinese, formula that he has developed with inulin and various prebiotics that he, is able to use in human participants suffering from type 2 diabetes. And what his data suggests that it's about 28 days to be kind of religiously, or consistently on something to really wholeheartedly shift those communities to where it will benefit the metabolic health. Because I think that's ultimately what you want to do, is not just give a diet a day or two, see this change in who's there and maybe what they're doing because you've altered a component of your diet, but that kind of like lifestyle modification that we're talking about that kind of needs some consistency takes about a month, 28 days, so a couple of weeks.
Okay, no, that's and it's so interesting how labile the gut sort of see, like, because it's not a ridiculous amount of time to actually see that sort of change. And is it the same with exercise, Sarah? So how long? So, well, I guess my first question is with regards to a lot of these studies have been done in mice, what do we know about the changes in the gut in like a human clinical trial or something with regards to exercise?
Right. So a colleague of mine, Jeff Woods, did a couple of human studies, and he showed, which was amazingly nice, that very similar changes to the gut microbiota occurred as a result of exercise interventions in humans as to some of the mouse studies, meaning that whatever either model the mouse model that we chose or the intervention that we used kind of mimicked what was going on in some of the humans. Those butyrate producers were higher, Faecalibacterium, Rosaburia, a bunch of those microbes we kind of put out there in 2016, he was showing also in humans about a year or two later. And so that was great to see that translational nature of an animal study coming over into humans. It was really not different, but interesting is that kind of once you detrained or stopped exercising, the beneficial changes went away. So like any lifestyle modification, right? Your diet's the same way. Once you start that good diet, once you start that exercise, it produces those changes and they persist as long as you engage in those positive lifestyle factors. The minute you kind of take them away, you'll regress. And that's exactly what exercise training is, right? I mean, you work 6 to 8 weeks to experience alterations in endurance versus resistance, training. And it only takes, endurance exercise can start, falling off, we know in a couple of weeks. You go on holiday or you go on a break and you've been exercising and you don't, and you come back and you're like, oh, that vacation was a nice, relaxing time, but my exercise really suffered as a result of that. So, there is something to the microbiome adapting to exercise as other systems adapt, right? It will adapt as long as you're providing that stimulus. And so that's kind of cool too.
It is cool. And so do these changes in the gut microbiome explain some of the adaptations that we might see with exercise, do you think?
That I am writing that grant literally as we speak.
Oh, amazing.
Yes.
So we don't know yet, but that is something another sort of hypothesis.
So I shouldn't say that. We did write that grant we're kind of looking at a separate one now of sex differences because we're noticing that there's sex differences. And I know that that's an area that we wanted to think about. But, some, I think some of the big questions, like you say, is, are there groups of microbes or certain microbes that maybe really help with this, exercise tolerance? And then by what ways do they do that? In
Yeah.
some ways, with the antibiotics that we knocked out, we can say, okay, well, we saw a reduction in oxidative capacity of the mitochondria, which is
Yeah.
critical to produce ATP so you can run. So, that's decent preliminary data to show, okay, well, maybe the microbiota has some link to the mitochondria, which has a bacterial origin, right? So there might be some communication that's going on there. And I think the metabolites that get produced by the microbiota are still sometimes hard to study. I mean, you can go through metabolomics and then get these big data sets, but, filing that down to find out what's relevant and how it's acting is a separate set of experiments that then takes the field one step further. And I think that that's kind of the steps that we're trying to take.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's so like, I suppose with everything in this area, it might seem sort of simple at sort of base level, but actually like super complex. Because of course, if you hear that your gut microbiome can impact favorably on exercise performance or recovery, then can you actually bottle that and take it as a probiotic?
Right. So, they did try that. That's the one always example is fit biome. I don't know if it's out. I know that there was some talks of it coming out, but there was that study that looked at the marathon runners. It was a
Yes.
cohort of like 10 or 12. It was a small cohort of marathon runners. Then they noticed that this villanella was really abundant in those marathon
Mm.
runners. And they linked that to one of the short chain fatty acids, propionate, and its function of altering, lactate metabolism. And we know
Mm.
lactate is one of those, or the lactate threshold is one of those really factors that dictate performance. So the
Yeah, yeah.
idea is that I think that fit biome was meant to bottle the villanella and see if it can improve performance. I think one microbe is not enough. I think in the concept of what we call a guild or a functional unit of microbes, that it's usually a group of microbes that function in a particular way that then have an outcome. And given that exercise just has so many outcomes as a
Mm.
result of performance, that you're going to find, in my opinion, and I could be totally wrong, right? This is the whole science of hypothesizing and then seeing if you're right.
Yeah, yeah.
But in some ways, I think that there's going to be several kind of groups or guilds of these microbes that you might find related to various aspects of training adaptations that promote then exercise performance. I don't know if it's
Yeah.
really only going to be one or two or even a handful. I think it's going to be a little more complicated than that. If you want to look at enhancing mitochondrial function, that might be its own group. But then say, does that do the same thing to, changes in angiogenesis with, alterations in capillary density to enhance, blood flow to the skeletal muscle? Would that, be a separate group of microbes? Those are the
Yeah.
kind of fun questions that we get to ask and play around with in the lab.
Yeah, totally. And I can imagine that sort of when you put all of those groups of microbes together as a group, is that just that your gut is functioning healthfully and you've got, a good environment in there. Whereas maybe is it that if you don't have these microbes, maybe that's just a sign that your gut isn't as healthy as what it could be. I don't know.
Right, right. And that's great. But you also bring up a really interesting, roadblock in research. And, because you talk about the gut as if, they're in your tummy, as I tell my kids, and doing their thing and so on and so forth. But to kind of study those microbes, sometimes you have to take them out and put them in, say, a mouse that has no microbes to see what it does, or in a petri dish to culture it and see what that metabolic function is. And the reality is, are they ever going to act the same in that tiny little group as they would in the context of that entire community that's actually in your colon? And
Yeah, yeah.
probably not. So that's like, one experimental kind of roadblock sometimes that we think about. And but those kind of studies still have to be done. I mean, if you give, say a mouse that has no microbes, a known set of microbes, and it can increase its runtime. Okay, well, that's saying something, then you
totally
look at the tissue and say, okay, is the mitochondria density bigger? Is the capillary density? Are the muscle fibers getting hypertrophy? Then you can start looking at little things here or there within the tissue itself to then determine, okay, it was A, but not B, right? This group of microbes did A, but not B. Okay, so back to the drawing board. How do we find the group of microbes that did this or that can do that? So I think I'll be in business for quite some time because I feel like there's a lot of questions out there, but it's just a lot to think about and consider, but it's still a lot of fun to do.
Yeah, totally. If we're thinking about, if exercise or the fact that exercise does change the gut, like what kind of exercise threshold are we talking about? So first from an aerobic capacity, like what, so if someone is coming from nothing, what type of, or how much, what's the sort of prescription, if you like,
right,
for that aerobic training in order to actually impact the gut?
That's a good question. I don't know that we have the answer to that just yet. Most of, I'd have to go back to Jeff's paper to see what he did with those humans several years ago and what he kind of implemented for them. I think it was kind of my guess is probably close to along the lines of what some of the guidelines are, at least 4 to 5 days a week, 30 minutes a day, but, and I think that that's another question in the field, that what I was saying in that one talk is, where are we going with this? Well, you have to look at all types of exercise, right? The different modalities. Does the marathon runner have a very different microbiota than the sprinter, which has a different microbiota from the resistance trained athlete? And does the bodybuilder have the same microbiota as the strength trained athlete, because they do very different things, diet wise, that could contribute. Yes. So I think that for the aspect of prescription right now, most studies have looked at aerobic exercise, and we know that that's, beneficial. And there's been a few on high intensity interval training, and that seems to, again, manifest itself beneficially with the gut as well. Not as much with resistance training, unfortunately, and definitely not enough to say, okay, you need to do X number of minutes, X days a week for X number of weeks to actually show this change. I mean, we exercise our animals for about 3 months, to kind of see that alteration.
And 3 months in mice years, in mice sort of time, is that like, a year in human time? I don't know. Is it?
So I don't know that I'd say, in that regard, one of the reasons we do 3 months is we kind of let them, instead of, although we've done this as well for 6 weeks, where you put them on a treadmill and you make them run for 45, 50 minutes a day, 4 to 5 days a week, which is the human recommendation. Yes. But there's also, the argument that, those mice naturally run so much longer. So there are some studies where we just let them be on a freewheel and just let them get on whenever they want to. And so, that might mimic more closely, say physical activity rather than prescribed exercise, but it's still kind of more suited to what that species would be in terms of activity. You know what I mean? Those are different kinds of, factors to think about. Nonetheless, I mean, it's still kind of hard to get, those studies done in humans where you're like, okay, can I have a muscle biopsy and a piece of your colon and some of that heart tissue? And cause I really would like to see, what's going on. And so mechanistically, sometimes those, studies, you have to go kind of back and forth between, the preclinical and the clinical model to really kind of test how it goes. Okay, we saw this here. Let's bring this here. How do we work that? And then, back to the drawing board and so forth. So,
no, that makes total sense. And then, Sarah, you mentioned about the whole detraining sort of impact. So, someone might be exercising and quite fit, and then for whatever reason, so they get sick. Like, like so many people, for example, with COVID, like they've got this real post-COVID fatigue and they're unable to do the type of training that they once worked, just as an example, I suppose, or it's taking them a time. Like, how long would it take for those changes to be reversed in the gut? Do we know that?
So, that's so funny you asked and gave the COVID example, because we put a proposal together. Unfortunately, it wasn't funded to look at, those kind of things, because, physical activity is obviously so important. And at least in New Jersey, we were talking with the major hospital here, and they were noting nearly 50% of their patients who noted that they could at least do the minimum recommendations in the ACSM recommends 150 minutes per week, that 50% of them post-COVID said that they were no longer able to do those kinds of exercise anymore. Like those long COVID symptoms really impacted that. So that, that's a really great question. In terms of, reversal, my guess is, I don't know that there's a specific time course. I know, for example, if you're on some antibiotics and you go off those to kind of get your microbiota back to its normal, whatever level that is for you, is about 2 to 3 weeks, so not nearly as long as it would take for that lifestyle modification to, really alter it, that 28 days. So, my guess is it would probably be still somewhere within that month. I don't know. We've pinpointed it exactly how long the detraining would affect. I think what will answer some of that is to find out to the extent to which the microbiota might maybe regulate some of those training adaptations. And then, we know some of those can go away in 2 to 3 weeks. Do you then notice that the microbiota is kind of reverted itself as well, and but like I said, it takes a couple of weeks to kind of have it rebound. So my guess is within that same time frame, you'll probably start to see a reversal, especially if you're no longer stimulating the system to do what it normally does on a training day.
Yeah. And how does it even work, Sarah? How does exercise change the gut microbiota? Like so you talked about the changes in the production of short chain fatty acids.
Mm-hmm.
Is that predominantly what we're seeing?
So that for right now, those are some of the big things in terms of metabolites that we're seeing. We've run a full, metabolomics with some of our other exercise animal models that we've been getting back. And as I said, those data files are enormous. So getting through some of that is quite cumbersome. But I think that that's a great question. I think some of the things that you'll notice that are probably going to be linked to the gut are related to substrate metabolism, which I think makes a lot of sense given the link to the gut and metabolic health, which is pretty clearly laid out. And one of the major side effects of exercise training is, this transition from using, predominantly carbohydrate as a fuel when you're untrained to, the use of more fatty acids. And I think that is one of the major things that probably enables that shift in the gut microbes.
Yeah. How much does individual variation sort of play a part? And obviously and so my next question will be about sex differences, but just individually, like, is it possible for everyone, do you think, to see the same changes, or is there something about their baseline gut health or gut function? Is that going to sort of dictate what happens for the individual?
Right. That's a good question. So I think, the estimate is that 1/3 of the gut microbe is kind of ubiquitous across everybody, but 2/3 is really unique, which is why they're the really excited gut microbiologists are saying, well, it could be just like blood work, it could be like your own very unique, signature. And to say that there's probably no variation, that baseline gut microbiota that's unique to you might allow or disallow for certain adaptations to occur, I think that'd probably be naive. I don't know that I've looked into that literature as much, or if it's even answered in the literature. Does that baseline gut microbiota either prevent or allow, certain things? We do know that the microbiota is settled by like 2 or 3 years old, right?
Wow, yeah.
And then it changes, over time due to, we know aging is one of the things, fluctuations in sex hormones, antibiotic treatment, for example. But that microbiota is shaped pretty early, even from where you birthed vaginally or versus a C-section. And, that kind of colonization can almost immediately play a role. And, they hate to say, but there's some evidence out there that predisposes to metabolic health issues. And it's like, is it really, does it really have to start that early? Is there no hope? And I think the research out there on diet and exercise and other things, will tell you, no, there's hope. Follow your healthy lifestyle modifications and you can get some of those beneficial changes. So I guess in some ways I'm saying there's probably some aspects of the microbiota that are unique to that individual and might dictate how they respond to things. But I think some of the lifestyle modifications in terms of healthy diet, engaging in exercise in particular, the two areas that I look at, I think can be achieved regardless of some of that baseline potentially.
Yeah. And that reminds me a little bit as you were talking about the different, just the potential impact of what we understand about people's genetic profile, and that, you are born with a particular set of genes, but your lifestyle will dictate how they're expressed and the impact that they might potentially have. So it sounds a little bit sort of similar to what you just talked about.
And so, the whole area of epigenetics, as you're just suggesting, is, how do those environmental factors influence? And you're right. I think many times those provide a greater stimulus to change than some of the hardcore genes, because you don't want to get super settled into, everybody in my family is this way. I'm bound to end up that way. And the truth is you don't have to be bound to end up that way. You can, maybe engage in some things that don't. And then when you start to look at those and say, I'd say, well, yeah, mom was really sedentary most of her time. And I've been really exercising most of the time, and so there are these really big differences in what I can see where, maybe she was versus where I am.
Totally. And a tangent, but you mentioned cholesterol metabolism at the kickoff of our call. And I often say that with people about cholesterol, like a lot of people are sort of that, high cholesterol runs in my family.
See, but I would argue that is the one thing that is genetically almost like, that has one of the highest genetic predispositions, actually.
Oh, okay. It's so interesting. But but there are things that you can, that doesn't mean that that exercise and a healthy diet isn't going to change your risk profile, I suppose, maybe outside of the cholesterol.
Right.
Story. Yeah. Oh, that's quite funny. Now you meant, so the sex difference thing, that's something I'm really interested in. How much does so I suppose first, the differences between males and females, I feel like I really want to just see, what's going on there. But also, what about a change for a woman across a menstrual cycle? Like, how might that impact on gut and the gut flora? So that's two questions.
So what's interesting is there have been a couple studies on menstrual cycle. My master's student just wrote his whole paper on sex differences. So thankfully it's fresh in the old line. And so there doesn't really seem to be a lot across the menstrual cycle. There are obviously hormonal fluctuations that occur, but that doesn't necessarily seem to really shift the gut microbiota too much. I think major changes to hormones, overreactomy or, estrogen deficiency, right, is going to manifest a major change. And we've seen that in our work, and it's been shown in others. And so understanding the roles that the sex hormones play and how it interacts with the gut microbiota is a really open area. And to qualify, the exercise impacts with that are kind of like what we're looking at right now, potentially, or writing up in this proposal, and just kind of understanding how do those things function and interact with one another. I mean, most studies will show that there is a difference in, kind of just baseline profiles between men and women. And so, that's a thing. We've seen that in our, studies as well, that the predominant microbes are different. The short chain fatty acid profiles are different. But But then you think about it metabolically, we are very different. Estrogen is a fat metabolism favoring hormone. And we tend to use more fat when we exercise compared to males who use a more carbohydrate based, metabolic profile. So it would make sense that those gut microbes would be different if we wholeheartedly believe in a host gut, symbiosis.
Yeah.
And so to me, it does make sense in that way.
Yeah. And then does that then manifest in performance differences, and the impact that the gut might have for women versus men? Is that different?
Right. So when you actually do that search, because I did, that was another 0 the other day.
Oh, interesting.
So that's in the grant. I don't publish. No, everyone's going to hear this. So yes, everyone, that's what we're doing.
Yeah.
So
no one trumps you on that. Yeah.
Right. But the good scientist reveals things that we're already doing in the lab, and then you put them in a proposal. So we're already kind of looking at these things. But it depends. What I'm also noticing is it does depend on kind of like what species you look at and what aspect of performance you're looking at, right?
Yes.
Because mice, female mice, many studies will tell you they run more than male mice. Other studies will say, they really don't. They run the same. Humans, we know there's an inherent biological kind of difference where there is about a 10% difference, especially in elite kind of performances, I was just reading a great review out of a joiner's lab at the Mayo Clinic. And, they were saying things like thoroughbred horses and greyhounds show no difference in elite performance between the male and the females. But then when you look at other aspects like fatigue or type 1 muscle fibers or strength, you'll see very distinct sex differences. So I think it really comes down to what aspect of exercise and performance are you looking at? And then using those interesting models that I was telling you about earlier, potentially like, using that germ-free mouse to see if there's microbiota differences, and then how that might manifest a phenotype in those types of animals. Does it make you more fatigue resistant? Does it not? And really kind of looking at that, because, that's the one thing you have to really look at it in that level of specificity, because it's not uniform across. Women are good at this and men have their advantages here. And so it gets very specific. So you have to think about those studies very carefully and read them very carefully.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, because as you were talking about fatigability, I was thinking about ultra running and how, we have women who are, and you don't see this in marathon, but you have women who outperform men. They're quicker along that super long distance.
Right.
And it would be interesting to know whether or not there was any sort of interaction with the gut, what impact or what sort of contribution might the gut microbiota and fatigability, for example, does that even play a role in that?
Right. I know. It's so many cool questions, right? Because then you start thinking about other things too with ultra marathons, and then, those really intense long distance runs or hot humid environments. And then you do start thinking about other aspects in the intestine that get disrupted. Does barrier function become an issue? That whole aspect of leaky gut, because those are two really good examples that we know of that impact leaky gut. Most other people, leaky gut, but exercise wise, it's really, those intense prolonged workouts or hot humid environments that kind of activate some of those things. And so, that then compounds the issue. How do you separate those types of things? So.
Yeah, totally. Sarah, you mentioned estrogen deficiency and gut and how that impacts on gut function. How does, or maybe the gut microbiome, how does the gut change like post-menopause? Like, do women have more, in the research, do we see women have more gut issues or should expect more gut issues post-menopause, or?
In the small cohort of people that I just talked to, yes.
Yeah.
I hate to say it, but there's definitely something, interesting about that. I think, an also understudied area that might be equally as important potentially is the progesterone, right? I mean, we get so
Yes.
focused on estrogen that my one, current master's student, she's like, Dr. C, I was reading all of these things and interacting with some of the physicians at the clinic I'm looking at, and, they're just concerned that progesterone gets lost, and that might be really important in how that impacts the microbiota and that function over time and with aging. And I think that's an interesting aspect of things. It's because we get so focused on estrogen and saying, well, that's the major cause of everything. And the reality is, well, how does progesterone's fluctuations also change, right? And
Yeah.
so, we do notice that there are changes, with aging and with estrogen deficiency and, the diversity of the microbiota and those things, which could then lead to potentially GI related issues. But as a person who has pre-existing GI issues, and I know everybody laughs when I'm getting to that age where it's like things are starting for sure, right?
Yeah.
That I definitely, notice that things just either don't metabolize the same or I can't
Yeah.
eat the same. And I was like, oh, this was okay a year or so ago, but I have to avoid this for some reason. And I'm pretty consistent because of my GI, with exercise and with diet. And so, one of the other explanations is, well, is it my age and the estrogen and,
Yeah.
potentially changes in that. And so I think about that a lot. The kids say, "Ugh, your mom, your, stomach hurts again." Shocker, kind of thing. And I'm like,
Yeah. Yeah.
you just wait till you lose your something, and I have boys, so I can't say estrogen, but, see what
Yeah,
happens to
yeah,
your gut.
totally. Well, it's interesting because that's similar with a lot of women that I speak to is that their tolerance or sensitivities, their food sensitivities just increase
Mm.
as they get into perimenopause and that menopause sort of phase. And I wonder if you study the gut and look at the microbiome and much we were talking about, can you take a probiotic to help with your exercise performance? Like, can you take probiotics to help sort of like settle your gut across this time and just help that environment?
Right. So those are great questions. There's a fantastic position stand on probiotics and exercise that came out a couple of years ago. And probiotics and exercise, the evidence is really equivocal. Like there's not a lot to
Mm,
overtly suggest that taking a probiotic will enhance performance, whether it be aerobic or anaerobic. But they don't do any harm, right?
yeah,
So
yeah.
I would never just say, don't take it, it's going to hurt you. I mean, it might not help
Mm,
you, but it's not going to hurt you. There is
mm,
really good evidence, in several meta-analyses that show that it does reduce sick time, right?
yeah,
And, a healthy athlete or not sick athlete is a training athlete. So in that way, you can say, okay, it could help performance just simply because you're training and you're not sick. Um,
mm,
but, I think the probiotic question, with aging and, to kind of, help is a good one. And again, I would say it's not going to hurt you.
yeah,
It's one of those things, once you start it, stay on it, because once you come off of it, everything will revert. So if you keep doing those probiotics, I would say in the context of, a healthy diet where you're also getting prebiotics and feeding those microbes what they need and so on and so forth, that's probably the best approach is, not just solely rely on one intervention, but have that in the context of the other lifestyle or healthy lifestyle things that you want to do.
yeah, totally. So, and I want to talk to you a little bit about that as well, like the whole prebiotic story, because that's the thing that's keeping your gut micro that that's growing, that's seeding the sort of the probiotics in your gut, right?
In essence, well, it all depends, right? So the probiotics, I think, are really limited to certain types of species and strains. There's not really much that goes outside of like the lactobacillus and the bifidobacterium, right?
Yeah,
And we
yeah.
know there are so many other microbes in the intestine that maybe could be beneficial and develop. And I think that that's where the literature, should be going, is looking at the function of these other microbes and could they be beneficial and bottled, for lack of a better word, right? And,
Mm.
the prebiotics are, what provide really the microbes with their food. They metabolize that. That's what leads to the production of those short chain fatty acids that then have those beneficial, aspects to not only the intestine, but we know now systemic health and so forth. And so
Mm.
you give them the probiotics, which you give them the bugs, and then you provide the prebiotics, which is the food for the bugs that are there as well. And they kind of then, again, work in concert with each other.
Sarah, do we know much about how butyrate's that short chain fatty acid that is produced to help sort of with like ATP or to help feed the gut microbiota? What about beta-hydroxybutyrate? So like, does it matter whether you just, you could take like a ketone ester, for example, or like a keto diet helps you produce more beta-hydroxybutyrate? Does that change? What's my question? I think my question is exogenous sort of butyrate versus what you are able to produce. Like, does that change the impact?
Right.
Yeah.
You know what? That is a great question. And I am going to do one of those age-old, don't ever be afraid to say that I don't know, because I haven't really looked into that literature as much as I should have. I know there are studies out there where they've fed butyrate and other aspects, but I don't know them well enough to be like, it definitely says this, because that would be misleading and bad science person on me to say that. So I haven't really, looked at, I know those studies are out there. I don't know that literature well enough to say, hey, here's like a quick summary of what I think is in there. So
yeah.
All right.
Yeah. No, that's good. Okay. That's great. No, completely. No, I love it. It's because I see that often as a, when you read about the types of things you should be eating for your gut and what you need, like I'm big on, for people who tolerate fiber, I'm a big vegetable person and I think that that's where most of us should really be focusing a lot of diet content or whatever. But of course, you've got people who might go on a keto diet, a very specific keto diet that's very rigorous and 20 grams of carbohydrate or less per day.
Right.
So you're not going to get that same fiber. And one of the arguments is, well, you produce beta-hydroxybutyrate. So you get that butyrate for the gut and the gut's going to be fine. So I just wanted, it's an interesting area for sure.
Yes, it is. And maybe I'll read and send you a summary at some point, but I don't know it well enough.
Busy for that.
Yes, I don't know it well enough to just, to provide a good, solid answer to that question. But I'm pretty sure that some of that's out there. Like I said, I have seen them, the studies where they fed butyrate, but not necessarily well enough to know what they've found.
Yeah. And actually, doesn't this just speak to the fact that, you're a professor in gut health and exercise and probiotics, but it's such a massive area like that, how can you possibly be an expert across, all of it?
Right.
Yeah.
And even, even still, when I'm searching for certain things, when, you're writing significance and innovation sections for grants, you end up finding keywords you never thought might be relevant. And you're like, oh, wow, there is this whole area that I didn't know about or that I thought wasn't as robust as it is. And it really is more robust than I anticipated. And that's, interesting. Another old saying besides don't be afraid to say, I don't know, is if you're thinking about it, chances are someone already has done it. Right. And that's sometimes how quickly science changes and or, how people think and have done those things. So those are two kind of good rules that I live by.
Yeah, totally. Can I ask you about antibiotics? I heard you talk on Mike T. Nelson's podcast about a mouse study looking at antibiotics and how that potentially blunted the training effect in that power study, as you mentioned. So that was looking at a mice model. Like, do we think that there is crossover there with regards to us training and potentially, because we're on people are on antibiotics.
Yes.
It's not an infrequent or an uncommon thing. So is there anything we need to think about there?
So, it's funny, after that conversation and when we were writing another grant, I started looking at and finding those random keywords that I never thought. And people had actually been looking at performance with antibiotics since the 1980s. And I was like, see, wow. I should have known. Someone else had already thought about it and did a study. And, a lot of the studies looking at the antibiotics Again, the evidence is equivocal, meaning they've found performance decrements or, nothing has changed about it. And I think one of the biggest caveats was always do you have these people and they're taking antibiotics because they're unwell, and then you're asking them to do this exercise, right? So is it really the antibiotic that's causing the fatigue in these studies that have noted fatigue, or is it the illness potentially, right? So I think that that's one of the things that would really have to, you look at it, as Mike was saying, and he's like, well, we just take a bunch of healthy people and give them a massive dose of antibiotics for a week and see what happens. And I was like, you can write the IRB, I'll do the studies, we'll make it happen. And, of course, then you start thinking about that. And I'm like, ugh, that's 6 months of work before you even see a human in a lab, that process. But there have been studies looking at antibiotics and performance since I mentioned one of the earlier studies I found was in the early 1980s. And again, one of the caveats was that you have to make sure you test them if they're on the antibiotics when they're not feeling ill, because that's a major confounding variable. But, there are some studies that definitely showed that there was some fatigue associated with the antibiotic use.
Okay. And so are you currently writing as a grant in your future in that space, or is that sort of removed from your more sort of current interests?
Well, I'd say antibiotic treatment is one of the ways that you can eliminate the microbiota. And so, that definitely comes into play if we want to determine the role of the microbiota by giving the animals an antibiotic cocktail so that it knocks it out, and then asking them to run or, do these kinds of things. A lot of times the antibiotic model is cheaper than, germ-free mice are really expensive. They require a really specific facility and really specific handling and so forth. So, those are the two kind of accepted routes to go to really look at, the microbiota's implications in a function, is to either have that mouse with no microbes whatsoever, or to eliminate those microbes with the cocktail.
Yeah. And Sarah, on the antibiotics and just us, like if someone is on a course of antibiotics for whatever reason, outside of performance, like at what point, how long does it take to restore the gut post antibiotics? Are you sort of across that? Like, do we know how long?
About 2 to 3 weeks.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah,
about 2 to 3 weeks. Yeah. They say to kind of recover. My guess is that there's probably the variations, probably how long were you on them? How high was the dose? How strong was the antibiotic? There are definitely differences in strength in those, and potentially what microbes do they target? The reason we give a cocktail is because you have the gram negatives and the gram negatives and the gram positives, and then this and then this. So you kind of have to get a couple of broad spectrum ones to knock them all out. So, is a really powerful broad spectrum antibiotic might knock out more than, just your run of the mill, whatever. My guess is I'm not the doctor of that. So my guess is I don't think all the antibiotics are the same. There's definitely ones that are much more potent than others. Yeah. My guess is that's probably going to play a role in that time to reseed after you've used them.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And then, finally, Sarah, with all of your research looking at the impact that exercise has on the gut and vice versa, so what are some sort of practical take-homes, I suppose, for some people in this area? So either what they can do to enhance their performance or just ensure that, what are some practical take-homes?
Right. No, gotcha. I think maybe we'll start where we finished, is that if you are maybe on antibiotics and feel well enough to train, that if you're not training up to your full potential, don't freak out. It could be because you've disrupted some microbes, right? That, might be critical for your training, and, just have a little patience, then allow yourself to recover from that cold and let your microbes recover from that, and you'll be back on your way. So I think that that's one thing just to think about, given, some of the findings that have come out recently and we've found. I think the combination, in the previous topic was the combination of like a pre and a probiotic, right? Make sure not only you decide to take the probiotics, that's great, but make sure you're also getting that nutrition to really feed the microbes those complex carbohydrates and those fibers that they really like to metabolize, that can provide those short chain fatty acids that reinforce those mucus layers in the intestine that really protect the epithelium from the inflammation and the immune responses and the pathogenic bacteria. And I think some of the other things is that, when you do exercise, that you might not realize it, but you are hopefully experiencing some beneficial changes to that microbiota that should, feed back to enhancing that performance. And, that's kind of where that field is headed. And hopefully you'll find some things coming out soon from either our lab or others and how that might work. And so I think those are some of the biggest ones to really think about with the field.
Yeah, that's great. And then for people who don't have great gut health, have struggled for whatever reason, and you mentioned some of the major impact that lifestyle can have on the gut, like would exercise be part of the prescription to better gut health? We talk about collagen and probiotics and certain other things, in the field.
Yeah, I think exercise can, this is where exercise is good, right? Kind of comes in. I think exercise is definitely a part of prescription for any, not ailment. That's not the right word I'm looking for, but, I think incorporating exercise is just a very good way to enhance overall well-being, right? It doesn't just, it's going to have your cardiovascular benefits. It's going to have your respiratory benefits. It can enhance gut health. We know that it's a really great preventative for things like colon cancer, right? So engaging in that kind of, exercise, regular activity can be a good prevention for those kinds of things. So, I think if you do suffer from gut health, I think a thing to think about is maybe start off with something like walking or even brisk walking before you get into something more intense, because you want to see how that and, whatever your disorder is responds to it. But don't be afraid to try to exercise and see what kind of changes might happen as a result of that.
Yeah, totally. And you're right. It makes so much sense, right? Like I've heard people say this so often, is that if you could like put exercise in a pill and like sell it, you'd probably solve 80% of people's sort of health conditions.
Right.
Yeah. So, it works on so many levels. So
It does. Yeah. And I think that's why you can't get it in one pill, because it does so many different things. You'd probably need a pill for this and that and that and that. And in the end, you'd end up taking too many pills. So just exercise.
Yeah, just exercise. That is awesome, Sara. Well, I'm really excited by some of those potential irons in the fire that you've got that we will potentially see sort of coming out of your lab. And where can people find out more information just about what you're doing in your lab?
Yeah, sure. Well, I'm at Rutgers University in New Brunswick, New Jersey, and if you just really, Campbell Lab or Exercise and Gastrointestinal Health Lab at Rutgers, that will lead you pretty much right to us. So you'll be able to find us there.
Amazing. Awesome, Sara. Well, you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you so much for coming on and chatting to me.
All right. Thank you so much for having me.
Alrighty, hopefully you guys enjoyed that conversation as much as I enjoyed chatting to Sara. And as you would have guessed from our conversation we had about interesting areas to explore, there's such a wealth of information that we don't know actually about the gut and exercise and all areas. So really looking forward to seeing what Sara's lab sort of brings out in the next couple of years. And next week on the podcast, I talk to Dr. Carrie Jones, who is the head of medical education at Rupa Health, all about hormones. Super great conversation, that one. So hope to see you next week. Until then, though, you can catch me over on Facebook at Mikki Williden Nutrition, over on Instagram and Twitter at Mikki Williden, or head on to my website, mikkiwilliden.com, where in addition to the recipe portal access, you can sign up to one of my fat loss or real food nutrition plans, or book a one-on-one consultation with me. All right, team, you have a great day. See you later.